Good evening, everyone. It is so good to be back. And we are here to talk about how do we move forward after election 2020. My name is Nyya Flores Toussaint, and I am a part of an initiative of the Religion and Society Department here at Union Theological Seminary that is having conversations with the Latinx community about our faith and about our politics. And so this is a continuation of our last conversation that happened before the election, which really discussed how do we decolonize interfaith dialogue. And we had an amazing group of panelists and guests from all over the world that joined us. And that actually can be seen on our Facebook and our YouTube if you would like to see that. But today we are here to talk about how the election has turned out and what this will mean moving forward. And so before I introduce our moderator, I would like to read a quote from Jean-Jacques Dessalines of the island or country of Haiti. Dessalines says, "It is not enough to have expelled the barbarians who have bloodied our land for 2 centuries. It is not enough to have restrained those ever revolving fractions that one after another mocked the specter of liberty that France dangled before you. We must, with one last act of national authority, forever assure the empire of liberty in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhuman government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating torpor. In the end, we must live independent or die. Independence or death. Let these sacred words unite us and be the signal of battle and of our reunion." And so now I would like to introduce our moderator, Reverend Dr. Samuel Cruz, who is an associate professor of religion and society at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, and is pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Over the last 15 years, Dr. Cruz has been conducting ethnographic research on urban and Caribbean Latinx religion, focusing predominantly on Pentecostalism and African-based Caribbean/Latinx religions, as well as comparative analyses of the Latinx religion and Euro-American religious traditions. So at this time, I would like to pass it over to Reverend Dr. Samuel Cruz.
Thank you, Nyya. I want to welcome everyone to this event this evening. Let me just say a few words about, let me just say I want to thank Nyya for all the work he's put into this and to all the panelists. And I want to thank Union Theological Seminary for supporting us in this second event dealing mostly with Latinx people. I want to say that we will be discussing many issues. So I'm not going to follow some system of categories of what I'm going to be asking. I'm just going to ask questions and we'll try to answer them as well as possible in a short amount of time. And maybe we were discussing we will have to do this again because there's just so much that we need to talk about as Latinx, as Latino, Latina people. But I want to introduce the panelists who are here with us today. And I have to say that I feel extremely honored and proud to have such incredible friends, such distinguished people. I will begin with Felipe Luciano, who is one of the most dynamic Latino public figures in the United States. He is a foundational leader of the Young Lords Party in New York, a 2-time Emmy recipient, former WNBC TV New York news anchor, and a phenomenal poet and a great friend. Felipe and I gossip so much so often. Every time I'm driving home for an hour, I said, let me call Felipe. We also have Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, has grounded her life's work in the powerful experiences of people of African descent. developing cultural institutions that affirm their impact on the world stage. She established the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute, was the second director of El Museo del Barrio, and is presently working on the co-creation of El Corredor Afro en Loíza, Puerto Rico. Welcome, Malta. Alexa Aviles has a long and distinguished career in community philanthropy, managing grants to keep youth out of the juvenile justice system, to support environmental and racial justice, and to revitalize native cultures and languages. She currently serves as the program director for the Sherman Foundation, where she manages grants to local organizations. Alexa is a candidate for City Council representing Sunset Park, Red Hook, and parts of Borough Park, Dyker Heights, and Windsor Terrace. Dr. Edgar Rivera Colón, que se mudó para California. He abandoned all his friends over here and left to I don't know why he went to look for over there. It's more COVID there than here. Is a medical anthropologist who trains frontline African-American and Latino HIV/AIDS activists in the use of ethnographic research methods in developing community-level interventions. For the last 15 years, he has been conducting ethnographic research on New York City's house balls community. We also have Reverend Dr. Raymond Rivera, who is the president of the Latino Pastoral Action Center, LPAC, and since 1984, he has preached, taught, and modeled Christ-centered holistic ministry, particularly in an urban context. His theological framework is ministering in a situation of captivity based on the Old Testament lessons of the people of history. Let me just say that between Felipe, Raymond, and Malta, we have three giants with us, and I say that sincerely, and I'm honored that they're here with us. We also have one of the emerging giants, Natasha Alicia Ora-Bannon. Her work focuses on the economic exploitation and discrimination against low-wage Latino, Latina immigrant workers, as well as legal support in the face of the economic and humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. Natasha is the past president of the National Lawyers Guild, the nation's largest and oldest progressive bar association, and co-chairs its subcommittee on Puerto Rico. We also have with us, I can't see his face right, oh, there he goes. Davis Ventura, que viene desde Quisqueya, is a longtime educator and founder of Santo Domingo's Outfest, the first and only LGBT film festival in the country of the Dominican Republic. Davis is also one of the main organizers of the Santo Domingo LGBT Pride Parade. Davis Ventura was the first openly gay progressive candidate for deputy congressman in the Dominican Republic. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here with us. So we're gonna start quickly. I wanna start quickly, and my first question, I said the question is open for everybody, but some I'm gonna address to people, some people in particular. This question goes to Natasha, Felipe, and Edgar. So the progressive Democrats seem to want to give Puerto Ricans a gift that actually smells. It's not a good gift. They think they're giving us a gift by advocating for statehood for Puerto Rico. They think that they're doing something wonderful for us. And I don't understand how they could see it as a gift, quite honestly, because how could you tell people, we're giving you enslavement, or you're enslaved and now we're gonna give you a different form of enslavement. We're not gonna let you choose. But Natasha, what do you think about that that's being thrown around by white liberal progressives?
A great question to start us off with. And I also am honored and appreciate being able to be in the space with all of you this evening. You know, I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is that the statehood party over time has really co-opted the narrative that has historically been used by independentistas and by progressive spaces on the island, which centers the struggle of self-determination and decolonization in the context of human rights. And that discourse has been somewhat co-opted over time because of the proximity of the Statehood Party to established electoral politics in the United States, namely the Democratic Party. And when their discourse over time hasn't proven to be successful in convincing the U.S. political elite to take up their cause, then they've really talked about this as a civil rights issue. It often gets reduced to a voting rights discourse, so that Puerto Ricans can vote for, president, or they don't have voting rights, and equality looks like voting rights, because that's the narrative that that U.S. citizens are most accustomed to in understanding democracy and in understanding equality. Instead of a much richer conversation on what that looks like, it's also a really false equivalent to reduce, all political rights and civil rights to the notion of voting, instead of understanding this particular context as a struggle of decolonization and self-determination. And when you see, for example, in the last couple of days, those that advocate for statehood, estadistas, equating, well, Joe Biden barely won, and people presume that was a legitimate democratic act, the citizens, and we are insisting that we accept those results. Why aren't you even taking the results of the plebiscite that just happened, for example, on the island, which only historically is put forward by one political party and is really kind of a glorified opinion poll? But you won't accept the results of the 20% of Puerto Ricans that voted for this. It's a false equivalent, because one requires an actual process of decolonization and understanding what that involves. And the other is a mere electoral act in an already established nation for people to choose their president. They really don't have anything to do with each other. But it shows how the narrative of voting rights and civil rights, that's the one that's most familiar in the US public imagination around social justice struggles, has gotten co-opted and really picked up by the Democratic establishment, because that's also, those established electoral politics are places where, those that don't advocate for statehood don't play in. They're not interested in convincing Democrats to take up their cause in the same way, even though both establishments, political parties, have been clear that statehood is not a favorite outcome, except most recently under the Trump administration, where the DNC and Democrats feel that pushing for statehood would give them control of the Senate, would give them a different Supreme Court. And that's a really problematic narrative for us to play with decolonization and self-determination in order to benefit the political outcomes of another nation, or to hope that one day, based on that, there will be enough political capital invested in our own liberation struggles to want to see that come to fruition. So it's a really problematic kind of dynamic to equate these two processes and narratives and systems that end up really kind of making invisible the actual struggle for self-determination that we need to be talking about.
Thank you. Felipe, you want to take a...
Yeah, I lay it at the feet of our native congressmen, our labor leaders, and our business leaders. I also lay it at our feet. We here in the United States have never developed a viable independent organization, one that believes in independence, that deals with local elections, that deals in local issues. We've never really developed it. Those who have advocated for independence, both in this country and in Puerto Rico, are usually white Puerto Ricans who have no real visceral connection to the poor, and to those who are less fortunate. Doesn't mean that their loyalties are any less intense. It just means they really don't know what it is to walk on 116th Street. We have to remember that when Puerto Ricans came, I don't want to get into this, we don't have it because we have not built an independent lobby. Remember what Dessalines said, how Nyya approached it. Nyya said, Dessalines said, it's independence or death. We hang on to life so desperately. We hang on to food stamps so desperately. We hang on for affinity with white people so desperately that we will do anything to be approved of by this beast. And when you talk about it, when you bring it up in mixed company, you find that Puerto Ricans tend to shy away from it. They tend to shy away from confrontation. We have to remember what happened to Albizu Campos. The man started a labor strike. He won it. They were after him from the very beginning. They tortured him in prison. They know, this country knows what we are worth to them. We don't know. And so as a result, we still have this sense of inferiority. We're not willing to tell the United States government, we don't need your help. Now, let's be honest. We have to be pragmatic. We cannot, we're not a nation that has a gold mine, but we do have tremendous resources. We can feed ourselves. We can have ecotourism. There are tremendous things to do if we decide to do it in a unified fashion. So, just to an addendum, I went to Chicago several months ago and I spoke with Jesse Jackson. And the first thing he said, this is one of my heroes. The first thing he said is, well, y'all need to be a state. And in the room with 3 Puerto Rican businessmen, todo de color, todito, who were nodding their heads in assent. So in other words, they had gotten there before I got there. And I told him, Jesse, I think you better step back from that position. Understand what independence means for us. These guys are thinking of the business contracts that they can generate. They're thinking of revenue. I'm thinking of the freedom of my people and the consciousness with which my people are thinking right now. We're culturally dysfunctional. We're cultural amnesiatics, and we need to lift our pants up and begin to move forward. Do not listen to these guys. Have they helped you yet? And most of them don't like being black anyway. So let's begin to look at that. And he stood there and watched me. He said, would you be willing to come on Operation Bootstrap, the radio station, and say that? I said, absolutely. So we did that. There are many people who now have given up on independence. I understand it. I understand that it's just so frustrating. We've been doing this for a long time. But freedom does not happen overnight. It's going to take time. The Young Lords the ideas of the Young Lords took 50 years. We now have lunch programs and breakfast programs in every school. It took us 50 years to do it. And it took a lot of bodies and a lot of blood. It's going to take sacrifice. And we say, la patria es valor y sacrificio. Albizu said it a long time ago. The country is valor and sacrifice. Independencia o muerte is what I say. You got to be willing to die for it. If you're not willing to, just like on these streets, I live in El Barrio, I'm looking out on these streets now. If you are not willing to tell the brother, listen, man, I think the best thing for you to do is move on because it ain't going to happen. Forget about it. He's going to take your money and take your dreams. You've got to make a decision about who you are as a person, as a man, or as a woman. And that's what Desalegn was absolutely right.
Edgar, Dr. Rivera Colon.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me on the panel. And I too share Natasha's. It's an honor to be here with such distinguished comrades and brothers and sisters. This is a declining empire. And I see that offer by these white liberal Democrats as a symptomatic of that. At the core of the independence struggle is the racialized class struggle that has defined Puerto Rican history for hundreds of years. So I think it's theater, along with being opportunism. And I think it's also on some level a pressure by the elites or an awareness, almost like the unconscious, if you will, the political unconscious of the elites, that the movement of world history has moved away from North America, that is now in China, in Brazil, in India, amongst the billions of masses of the global South. And I see this as sort of an invitation to a deeper, sort of integration into the American Death Project, the Babylonian Compromise, if you will. And I think that one of the things we as Don Juan used to say this, Juan Antonio Correja used to always say that people are free and liberated in Puerto Rico when they act like it, right? It's almost like the idea of the kingdom of God. It's here, not yet, right? So I think that for me as a socialist, I've always seen the Puerto Rican struggle as a one part of a larger race and class struggle. And I think this empire is in decline. It's in deep crisis. It's a failed state. There are 250,000 people that have died. 150 1,000 new cases today in the United States of COVID-19. And as a veteran of the AIDS struggle, the HIV/AIDS struggle, I can tell you, when a ruling class is willing to kill 250,000 people, that's a ruling class in deep trouble, in crisis. And Trumpism is a symptom of that. So it seems to me that when I hear this stuff, I hear it as white noise, right? White noise in terms of the empire that is declining. And I'm both a Christian and a Marxist, so I'm very comfortable with apocalyptic terms and the decline of empires. That's sort of where we hit pay dirt ideologically. And so I think we should ignore it, and our people will continue their struggle. And one thing that did happen in Puerto Rico is that the two-party monopoly has been broken in Puerto Rico recently. And maybe we can take a little hint from Puerto Rico, how to get a person out of government, make the country ungovernable with this Rosselló minor, and also how to break up a duopoly of parties that serve mostly the white elites of Puerto Rico.
You know, I raised that question and we'll move on because I'm just sick of the Democratic Party trying to blame any loss on people of color. And meanwhile, they behave as if they're so intelligent and progressive and moral, but they want to add another layer to the colonial process. What they should be talking about is ending the colonization of Puerto Rico and then let people vote. You can't vote while you're under subjugation. Let people be independent for 10 years and let them then decide whether they want to come back into captivity. Bishop, I said I would go all over the place. So Bishop Rivera, some commentators have been saying that when white racists say that they're voting against socialism, that they really deep down inside know that that Biden is not a socialist, or even AOC in the pejorative sense of the word, because I'm a socialist, but not in the way they try to portray it as Soviet communism. But that the real issue is that they're racist, and it's easier to say I'm voting against socialism and not voting for racism. Do you think that the evangelical movement, when they use the excuse of not voting for Democrats because of freedom of choice, they're anti-abortion, what they're really saying is we don't want to admit we're ugly and that we support ugly policies, and they're using abortion the way white supremacists are using socialism as an excuse? Do you think that the abortion issue is not really real? It's just an issue to keep people voting in right-wing, racist, conservative ways?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I also feel honored to be on this panel with such distinguished cultural and political and social critics. And as far as the abortion issue is concerned, I think, to be totally authentic, there are many people of faith that are Catholic and people of faith that are evangelical and Pentecostal that really have a spiritual conviction that the fetus is life. And I think the issue of abortion is really a theological issue. Does life begin at conception? Does it begin at birth? And I think some people literally believe that, in that. That's totally different, I think, that the whole white evangelical church, I think they manipulate that issue. They manipulate our people into single issue voters, or basically abortion and the whole gay marriage issue. And they basically create that narrative in our people so that they can manipulate their vote. I think that has worked to some degree. Some of our people, because of their spiritual convictions, have been manipulated into that context, but it's not monolithic. Latino evangelicals, Latino Pentecostals are not monolithic. I myself have always been a progressive in my politics, and there are I'm chairman of over 3,000 churches, and several of the board members endorsed Biden, even though we didn't as an organization because of 501c3. So this whole notion that all Latino evangelicals, all Latino Pentecostals are single issue voters is not accurate. There is some diversity there, and certainly the emerging generation, that generation that is seminary trained, that has been educated to a greater degree, are moving away from a colonial theology that's been transplanted by this dominant culture. Evangelical, yes, but it really has its roots in the Reformation. It has its roots in the Great Awakening. It has its roots in the Azusa revivals of the early 19th century. There's always been a dominant racial perspective to our theology. The great paradox, and I'll end with this, as far as indigenous Pentecostals like myself and Felipe, we grew up in the same church, Tempo Betel, on 110th Street in El Barrio. Indigenous Pentecostalism has an indigenous hymnology, has an indigenous leadership. We have our own history of indigenous role models. We probably own more property than any political and cultural institution in the Latino community as an indigenous Pentecostal structure, but we don't have an indigenous theology. Our theology is still Eurocentric. It still dominates our worldview, but that generationally also is beginning to change. I've been one of the pioneers and guardians of that, and I've been criticized. I've been a pastor for over 50 years. I attended the People's Church when Felipe took it over and negotiated with the police so they wouldn't get killed. So he has a lot to thank me for, and I'm only teasing. But so there's always been an indigenous church, and while we're seen as escapists, while we're seen as otherworldly, I contend that the indigenous church has really been a countercultural narrative, and it's been a protest against the dominant culture, and it's been a theology of survival for our people, just like the Black church was a theology of survival during slavery. Indigenous Pentecostalism, indigenous African religions has been our way. A lot of people quote Marx, and the brother said that he's a Marxist as a Christian, and they say religion is the opiate of the masses, but they don't say the whole phrase. Marx also said religion is the cry of the oppressed. So basically it is that indigenous counter narrative to the dominant culture that we have to perpetuate as an indigenous church, and the white evangelical church tries to limit our people to the issues of abortion and gay marriage because it serves their political agenda.
You think there's any value in white evangelicalism, or should it be completely trashed?
Well, I have to be authentic. The evangelical church is rooted in its missionary enterprise. And its missionary enterprise, while it was an instrument of oppression and colonization and a colonial project, it also came to many of our countries and many people, and to the inner city, many people like me, that I was a young kid, high school dropout on the fringes of becoming addicted to drugs. And that message that historically was received to some degree by white dominant missionaries reached me. So there's an existential tension between the message of the white evangelical church that focuses on personal transformation and deals with issues of addiction, alcoholism, and all of these other places in the inner city. There is a duality, a tension between that message of personal transformation and then the message of systemic oppression that confuses what I consider authentic biblical Christianity with American civil religion.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you.
Sorry, I said too much.
There is, right? There's always tension. I was thinking of myself when Edgar spoke, and I'm a Christian neo-Marxist with interest in El Egua. But Malta, there's the Black Lives Matter movement has taken a big place in our country in the last recent years, a powerful place, I would say. How do you see the state of people of African descent within the Latinx community, Latino community? Has there been progress in a positive way? I know there are organizations now doing more so than ever Afro-Latino work, but where do you see, you've been working on this issue of race and racism longer than anybody I know. And I would like to hear your opinion, and I think others should hear it.
I'm not sure of the question. Ask me the question again.
Where do you see the Puerto Rican and Latino community at large dealing with the issue, the real issue of racism?
Well, I think that we need to go historically, right? In terms of what we've done over time. I think that when we talk, we take immediate history, right? Or what we're happening or what we're living through immediately. But our communities have been at the front lines of racism, historically. I mean, when my dad came from Loíza to New York City, he could not get a job because he was Black, right? In addition, he didn't speak English. So we know that racism has existed and we have fought racism. And you know that my feeling about how I identify, I don't identify as Latina or Latinx. I identify as an Afro-Boricua woman, as an Afro-Puerto Rican woman, because I think culture has a lot to do with it. And I think that color has a lot to do with it. And also how people understand our experiences, right? So going back, we know that enslavement existed in Puerto Rico. We know that racism exists in Puerto Rico. We know that exists in the United States. When we came here as African descendants, we have continuously faced discrimination, not only from other groups, but from within our own groups. And I think that one of the things that I have found throughout my development is partnership and coalition with African-American US and those of us who come from Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, and other locations. The issue is making sure that you work intentionally to build those bridges, right? Because we've all been miseducated. We've had this conversation. People think that because you're born outside of the US, then you're not Black, right? There are more Blacks in Latin America and the Caribbean than there are in the US. If you go back historically, 400 Africans were brought to the United States. The rest of the 15 million were left in throughout Latin America, what we understand as Latin America and the Caribbean and European locations and so on. So that Blackness in our community is extensive, right? That we hide it, right? Because of European and Spanish oppression, because remember the Spanish and Portuguese were the first enslavers. And we don't talk about that. And enslavement lasted longer in our communities than it did in the United States. So that when you look at us, you have African traditions that are alive and well. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when the 50s and 60s came forward, many African Americans initiated into African religions via Cubans and Puerto Ricans. So there have been those kinds of networks and those kinds of relationships forever. that they're not celebrated, that they're not talked about, that they're not brought to the fore, and that we continuously, which is problematic for me, is use Europe as the yardstick for whatever we do, silence our voices and invisibilizes us. So that I think there's a conversation that has to happen now that the numerical majority is us, that a voting bloc has been risen in this election, and not because of Biden, because we understood that we are on the front lines of death because of COVID and other realities, that we have a power block that we need to build and we need to network with, and we need to develop the criteria that we want to go forward with, which I think is the focus of this conversation. I have always built and looked to build my own institutions because I think that those institutions that do not see me, do not want me at the table, why would I want to be at that table? I don't want to fight to be at somebody's table. I want my own table. And I want my people to have their own table and their own values and their own criteria and their own presence and their own naming. So that to do that, we need to build our institutions. We need to build our own value systems and criteria that are inherent in our cultural traditions.
Thank you, Marta.
Does that answer it?
And you know, the truth is that we all know that Malta has built institutions. She's just not talking about it, and she's building one now in Piñones, which I had the pleasure of taking 10 of my students over there to spend a week with her and Cruz from Copy, and it was wonderful. You know, I want to talk a little bit about the elections, Latino vote, but before we go into the wider election, I have a question for Alexa in terms of Latino leadership votes. This might be naive from a political perspective, political of party context, but I constantly say to myself, 2/3, about, if not more, about 2/3 of the population in New York City is made up of Black and brown people. And we keep on electing white mayors. I mean, I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but what do we need to do to build up leadership and support leadership that is coming up in the Latinx community? That's the question. Let me just say something so that we don't forget. Let's not leave here without talking about AOC. And what I mean about that is how we need to support her. She's being attacked from all over. And she is a national leader. And she's amazing, and we need to figure out ways. I'm assuming that most of us support her, you know, in this panel. I'm risking that. I don't know. If you don't say it. Go ahead, Alexa.
Great. Thank you so much, Pastor Cruz, and thank you for inviting me to be amongst these giants. So I'm very humbled to be here. Yeah, you know, so this question around leadership pipeline for me boils down to two commitments, right? To a consistent individual commitment that you hold and you implement every day of your life as part of honoring your ancestors and the struggles before you and how to move it forward, which I think folks lose throughout their path. But also an institutional commitment. And I feel like our community in New York City, while dominant in numbers, and certainly in every other realm, has really failed to deliver these institutions, make enough institutions, keep building on those institutions, and instead have invested in other people's houses. And we've allowed many of our institutions to flounder. We haven't figured out how to keep kind of building and building bigger. I mean, we are a city of dynamic Latino leaders from many, many different communities, and yet we remain very siloed. and we remain disconnected and still fighting those struggles, right? That we should have perfected, because we are multi-generational presence, certainly in New York City and in this country. So I think there's, that institutional commitment to really to build, and I think it has to happen at every level, right? We need our policy institutions. We need the institutions, Marta, that you have built. We need it in every sector. There should be no reason why a young Latinx person wants to move into the political space and has to go to white progressive organizations for that kind of training and development, right? We have all these assets within our community. And so the hope is really that we leverage what we got and we lean into that power. We have the political power, we have the capacity, but we haven't exerted it to the extent that we need to. So that would be my hope for our community, is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and there is nothing that we cannot accomplish. And the larger community has been, the sleeping giant of Latinos. They've been worrying about us for like 40 years. And hopefully in this context, we have realized that our numbers are great, and we can fundamentally change structures here in ways that are going to transform for our communities. So,
thank you, Davies. How do you think the situation here, the politics here in the United States, affects the human rights of the LGBT community throughout the Caribbean and Latin America?
Muchas gracias. Yo voy a hablar español porque yo estoy muy descolonizado y el idioma que hablo perfecto es el español, y me siento muy contento de hablar castellano caribeño. Así que voy a pedir disculpas porque posiblemente hable muy rápido, como hablamos los dominicanos, pero esa es mi lengua. Y luego tú haces un resumen, Samuel, si quieres, para los que hablan inglés.
Si hablan muy rápido.
Lo primero es que... No te preocupes, tú toma una notita de esto. Lo primero que yo quiero decir es que tenemos que reconocer que el mundo está conectado y que no está conectado desde ahora. Y que todos nuestros países, nuestra historia está marcada desde muchísimo tiempo por la colonización, por las potencias, primero europeas y luego la potencia norteamericana, que a partir de América para los americanos se apoderó de nuestros territorios y creó una narrativa y una dependencia de nuestros países, dependencia que está muy enquistada. Y tenemos que saber que también, a partir de la globalización, las naciones están más conectadas que nunca. Incluso se debate el concepto, ¿no?, de nación cerrada en este momento, porque una isla ya no es una isla. Por ejemplo, Dominicana tiene una conectividad por internet que hace que los temas lleguen muy rápido. Puerto Rico también, las islas del Caribe están muy conectadas y vinculadas a esta potencia que es los Estados Unidos. Por tal razón, lo que pasa aquí tiene mucha fuerza en nuestros países a intencionalidad. Yo voy a poner un ejemplo. Cuando Obama declaró, en la segunda presidencia de Obama, se declaró aquí el matrimonio homosexual, lo que pasó en el Caribe fue impresionante, porque ya aquí se habló de lo que la iglesia evangélica están haciendo en el Caribe. Pues en ese momento nosotros vivimos en Trinidad y Tobago, en República Dominicana, lo vimos en Cuba, como las iglesias evangélicas de aquí, apoyadas por grandes empresarios de aquí, que vieron perdida una batalla en Estados Unidos, iniciaron una batalla de la fe en el Caribe, que hizo explotar nuestros movimientos. Nosotros nos tocó sufrir, a partir de la declaración del matrimonio homosexual en los Estados Unidos, la mayor embestida nunca vista del movimiento fanático conservador estadounidense, poniendo dinero y fortaleciendo estructuras en todo el Caribe y Latinoamérica para impedir el avance del movimiento LGBT. Y el movimiento de los derechos humanos.
Davis, creo que es muy importante, si puedo traducir la última parte en inglés, porque es muy importante.
Okay.
Saying, and I'll do the best I can, that when the United States, when Obama supported same-sex marriage here in the United States, and the evangelical, homophobic, racist white church saw its battle lost, that they lost the battle, they put all their efforts into going to attack and support anti-human rights positions in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's also been seen in Africa, where these
Y claro,
super
en África hemos visto países enteros invadidos por los misioneros, y eso vino a partir de un hecho trascendental que pasó en Estados Unidos. Venía dándose antes, pero se fortaleció y aumentaron los recursos económicos de grandes inversionistas y empresarios conservadores estadounidenses, porque ellos dicen, no vamos a permitir que este avance se dé en el Caribe ni se dé en África. Y eso tiene una vinculación con que son territorios que considerados todavía por la mente colonizadora como territorios de cruzada. O sea, es una visión colonizadora, una visión de conquista.
I think we should mention that it's very interesting that those are the same people who are advocating pro-life stance, but they are okay with killing gay people in other countries.
Claro.
So it's not consistent, their ideology.
Entonces, si ustedes miran, la lucha que se dio aquí es una lucha ideológica interesantísima. Es lucha entre el movimiento conservador más radical de los Estados Unidos frente a movimientos que están exigiendo derechos humanos, porque el Partido Demócrata no hubiera ganado estas elecciones si no se alía con Black Lives Matter, si no se alía con los movimientos indígenas, si no se alía con los movimientos hispanos y con el movimiento LGBT, que lo que busca es derechos humanos. La lucha política en este país es ahora derechos para todos o derechos para los blancos. Es la lucha que está dando aquí, y esa lucha la estamos viviendo nosotros de igual manera en el Caribe. De manera, yo estoy aquí porque siendo político recibí 2 amenazas de muerte. Yo recibía los videos en las iglesias evangélicas haciéndome exorcismo a mi fotografía de candidato. O sea, yo vi una manifestación porque Obama nos colocó un embajador gay en República Dominicana, Wally Brewster, y una manifestación de casi 1 millón de personas en contra de esa decisión de Obama. Y a partir de ahí vi cómo se recrudeció en mi país la discriminación y los caucus en el Congreso y en la Presidencia de la República de parte del movimiento conservador. O sea, que lo que pasa en Estados Unidos, y eso es muy lamentable, porque en Estados Unidos, y da mucha pena, como dijeron anteriormente, la gente que lucha incluso se olvida de que tiene que haber una mirada de aquí para con nosotros los que estamos en el Caribe, en Latinoamérica. Y muchas veces en los movimientos socialistas, en los movimientos de lucha aquí, nos desconectamos mucho, y eso hace que nosotros los latinos no sintamos empatía, porque no es una lucha. Yo tengo mis raíces dominicanas. Yo soy dominicano, yo vivo en Nueva York, yo soy un dominicano que vive en Nueva York, me siento muy bien, pero yo soy dominicano. Y muchas veces siento que la lucha no se conecta con mi realidad. Mas, sin embargo, el movimiento conservador sí tiene profundas conexiones en el resto del continente. Sí está muy organizado de manera internacional. Voy a poner otro ejemplo. La OEA este momento...
Davis,
¿ya?
Queremos a ver si podemos hacer un resumen de las cosas buenas que dijiste. So,
okay.
Natasha, would you like to maybe, I saw you taking some notes, help with this, and maybe a little summary, because it's good stuff you said.
Yeah, I can do a quick summary and then feel free to hop in, right? Luis was speaking about, well, he started off talking about how the notion really like of isolated nations and nationhood no longer exists, particularly in the Caribbean, and how interconnected we are, which is why what happens in one space deeply affects the others, particularly in the country of the United States. And the struggles that take shape there have, are echo, not because they're mirroring what's happening in the US, but because they have their own resonance that take place. And he, in talking this last segment about the effect, the transcendental effect of the conservative aspect of the church, that has most recently come to light, and this last election showed it, is that there's really a conservative ideological organizing effort that runs counter to the struggle for human rights and dignity. And when you see how, you know, Biden won by being forced to build alliances with social and political justice movements, economic justice movements like Black Lives Matter, like LGBTQI rights, like feminist spaces, otherwise wouldn't have. And yet the strongest opposing force to that has been this conservative church that's directly oppositional to demands for human rights and social justice. And feel free to fill in on whatever I miss.
Yes.
Solamente para terminar, Samuel, decir que no se sabe aquí que la OEA, que es una entelequia, ¿no? Pero la OEA fue tomada por el movimiento conservador. O sea, en este momento no se puede acudir a ninguna cumbre de la OEA y poner un tema asociado a mujeres, a LGBT, a aborto, a migración, sin que no haya un boicot, pero un boicot grosero dentro de las asambleas por el movimiento conservador que, apoyado por Trump, ha desvalorizado este organismo de colaboración internacional tan opresivo, pero que en un momento recibió un aire, pues, de mediación interesante en el continente. Está tomado, no sirve ahora mismo como mecanismo de articulación continental, porque ha sido tomado por el movimiento conservador estadounidense, y eso no se mira en los Estados Unidos.
So he also, Luis mentioned that the Organization of American States, which is a regional multilateral political institution, has recently been taken over by the US-based conservative movement that has co-opted all of the mechanisms within that space that include, for example, like the Inter-American System, the Court and Commission on Human Rights, where you can no longer go to any of the entities within this political and judicial system to talk about women or gender issues, LGBT struggles, abortion. You're going to be met with this tremendous conservative resistance that has been intentionally infiltrated and integrated based in the United States, starting from the United States.
Thank you so much.
I would like to add that one of the problems that we have is how we define masculinity, how we define bravery and courage, how we define men. I have found that you can be a man, you can love your masculinity and still love gay people. I do not understand how men can sit by and watch a trans or bisexual woman or a transvestite or a gay woman get beaten up, almost killed, and stand there in silent dissent. I think it's insane. That is not what chivalry is. That is not what being a man is. So we need a re-education of our youth. Part of the problem that we have is the tremendous antipathy that so many men of color have toward women. It's taken me years, and I'm still fighting it. It's taking me years to get past this. After the beatings from my mother, after all of the stuff that I went through, the homophobia that I went through as a child, it took me a long time to understand that person is not the reason for the stuff that happened in your youth. So we need to educate men that beating up a gay person or not supporting a gay person is in fact not being a man. So we need to do that. That in addition to build, pardon me?
I think I wouldn't even frame it as that's not being a man. I would just frame it as that's not what you do, period. And it's just, that's not what being a human being is. Once you take it into a gender, you bring it into a man thing, it creates problems in itself.
Yeah, but let me make this clear, Sam. We better start defining how and where we want to place limitations. If we want to develop a sexless generation, if we want to develop AI to the point where we have no feelings, I think, this is my personal opinion, that men and women think differently. I think we're wired differently. For whatever reason, the DNA has made that happen. I'm not saying that we are so different as to make us complete foreigners to each other, but I think there is a difference between a man and a woman. And it's causing a lot of guys out here tremendous confusion because they don't understand it. I have seen guys from Mexico, I've had to stop them. They see a woman walking around in pants or kissing a woman, and immediately they want to intervene. And I have to tell them, hermanito, eso no se hace aquí. You cannot condemn them because they want to kiss each other. It's difficult. But I think we're going to have to define what it is. I'm not of the opinion, and I'm going to make that clear, that we're just human beings. Yes, we are human beings. I happen to be a man. Marta, Natasha, and Alice happen to be women. That's it. They have ovaries. I have testicles. I have testes. But there is a difference.
There might be a physical difference, but gender is basically socially constructed concept.
It is.
Let's move on with beyond, because we want to stick to the political and some other cultural issues. I have a question. You were going to, Natasha and Alexa, if you want to respond, go ahead. Go ahead. You saw, I thought you were going to respond. Go ahead. I don't want to stop.
Yeah, actually, Alexa, do you want to start? I'll just be quick. I hear you, Sam, and I actually think this is a political issue. A couple of very quick things. There's, I think, a lot of presumptions made in those statements, including about like the gender identity of people here, but also what we're talking about when we're talking about structural oppression isn't how individual men feel. We're talking about patriarchy and how it gets implemented in toxic masculinity, gets infused in, repeated in, and acted upon our lives in forms that are far beyond individualization of them and how any individual feels about their own gender expression and gender identity. Patriarchy is what produces that violence. And if we want to think about how to interrupt and disrupt it, I don't think it comes from a place of reinforcing traditional notions of gender expression, because that hasn't been useful thus far. It's about understanding how power operates and how it operates within the context of that historically crafted and created gender notions to continue to inflict violence upon us in our lives. I think it's a very different lens with which we should think about and view these issues.
You know, Alexa, and then we'll move on.
I just have to say, underscore Natasha, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to say, and you said it 10 times better.
Natasha, I have a question for you. I think I've addressed everyone individually already, but I have a question for you. So what about Latinx democracy making? What it means and what does it look like in a society like the US that still does not contemplate our involvement in meaningful ways outside of consumerist behaviors?
Yeah, so for Latinx folks in the US, right? I think you know, in many ways the post, I don't watch sports, but I guess like the post-football, whatever, quarterback, whatever's going on in post-election analysis has only talked about, what was that?
I think they call it Monday night quarterbacking, is
there
it?
you go, right. See, my Monday nights, I do other things. It has really only talked about voter turnout, like that the sleeping, you know, the Latinx voters that are turning out and being motivated, not because they're in favor of a particular party, I think, as much as they're, you know, a vote against fascism, but that the idea of showing up in this democracy is reduced to one civil act every 4 years, and there isn't any other social, economic, or political space that's created for actual citizenship. I mean, if you talk to Black and brown people, I think in this country, there's no sense of privilege or entitlement that comes from citizenship, right? We don't have that, you know, it's a passport. We don't have any sense of what it means to really fully own your democracy and participate in it, in the act of democracy building and the defense of it. And so when you get isolated, when all of our social movements get relegated into an electoral politics lane that waters it down and reduces it to partisan demands instead of understanding what their actual struggles are about every 4 years, we're trying to shift the narrative to go back to that organizing work and say, like, this is not where we win at the polls. Like, that's not where our space for struggle is, even if it's one of the like trincheras, right? Where we win is elsewhere, because this was never contemplated for us. It wasn't designed with our survival, you know, in mind. And so for us, what does it mean for us to show up in a racial capitalist society, a model that was built on a slave economy? What does it mean for us to show up in an empire where US exceptionalism infuses our movements, and where people, even in social justice spaces, don't feel accountable to have to respond for the acts of our government in our name to our brothers and sisters and family members outside? And when that kind of comes home, we have a sense of, you know, of privilege, and then like, oh, this has never happened before. You know, what does it mean to show up in an apartheid society where structural racism is so embedded in all of our institutions? That, I think, is a much more difficult and different conversation. And how the anti-Blackness that's prevalent in our community, right? How white supremacy and the proximity to whiteness is what is informing this post-electoral conversation. Well, you know, it's reduced to South Florida or parts of Texas, and it doesn't fully understand and engage, like, what does it mean for us to own our space in a very different way, and to challenge, to have an analysis of power and structural oppression that allows us to build power in a way that's not tied to, you know, voting, which is what it gets reduced to, because then the state can regulate it and control it and co-opt it ultimately, right? So to me, that's a kind of much more interesting conversation that I think we should have.
Natasha, have you ever had to fight for your life on the streets?
Yes, I'm a woman. I walk the streets.
No. I'm saying, have you ever had to fight for your life on these streets?
I don't understand.
What I'm saying is, you were talking about patriarchy, and you were bringing up all of the regular arguments that people have against men who are saying, I'm a man. And that I think that we're geared differently. I've heard these arguments before. And I have seen a generation of Puerto Rican and Black men who have refused to stand up. There's no righteous indignation. If you've never had to fight for your life on these streets, if you've never faced a gun in your face, if you've never faced gangs or cops, racist cops, then you got to look at it in a different way. If you and I are walking down the street, hold on, doctor. If you and I and Alexia are walking down the street, and somebody says to you, I don't care if he's Black or white, what are you doing with those white girls? The first thing I would do is, first of all, they're not white, they're Puerto Rican, and they're Black. Second is, I would try to take him out. He would have a hard time with me. And by the way, I just got over an operation, but that's just the way it is. I do not want to start categorizing, but I think we have a problem in terms, when you're talking about liberation movements, what do we do now? What do we do now as organized? But we need men. We do need men. I find more and more of our guys are nihilists. They hate women. They are not dealing politically. They don't understand that politics, electoral politics, is a chess game.
Let's move on at this point. Let's move on. Edgar, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to ratify what Natasha said. Before I became a medical anthropologist, I'm actually trained as a sex gender anthropologist. And although I do need men as an LGBTQ person, I think it may be a different valence than what Felipe is talking about. I think that gender is an embodied technology of power, and there's not two, there are many genders. There are many genders. And in fact, one of the missions of critical gender studies was to explore the possibility of a world, not that it's genderless, but the multiplication of genders, unlike the Marxist tradition, which is really the elimination of class. So I think that one of the things I would say is that it's not an individual problem, that there's a structural, institutional piece of this, and that gender even includes our categories of knowledge, right? So I think one of the things I also want to say to Natasha is that I think she's framing it very well. And I think all of us in one sense have lived this. And I think Davies has talked about this. The countries that exist on this side of the world are white settler states. They create political instruments that ratify that kind of rule and governance. And That's the basic problem, is that they keep on having us retort to the electoral format as the format, when in fact, by the time you get a progressive into an electoral position, it's because there have been mass struggles for decades, right? So AOC is a product of BLM, as far as I'm concerned, right? And we should consider a point that Kali Akuno, our comrade in Mississippi from Cooperation Jackson, made a couple of years ago. He said something very instructive. He said he saw Black Lives Matter as a delayed response to what happened in Katrina and the failures of the Obama administration. What we've seen with the kind of political ecology we have now, where capital is invading habitats of species and therefore creating new pathogens to kill us, basically, right? What we see now is a deepening of the crisis and the quickening of it. I can tell you for sure that this will not be the last pandemic we go through in the world. This will not be the last global pandemic, precisely because the capital accumulation strategies of basically the ruling classes of this country, what Davis talked about globalization, the accumulation strategies of scale of these folks are going to continue to invade the habitats of animals that you don't have contact with. It's going to continue to create this. And the public health and corporate healthcare system that we have now, which is based on just-in-time production, which means just enough hospital beds, just enough healthcare personnel. And under those conditions, we're going to continue to see mass death. We're not even talking about the climate clock that is ticking every day. And we know that indigenous and African peoples, and I want to say that it again, world history of Muta, China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, all these knowledges will save us. The knowledge of farmers, the knowledge of the peoples of the land. And I think one of the things that the illusions we have to get rid of, honestly, is that with the Biden win, we can return to normal. Normal is what produced Trump and Trumpism. Right?
Well, this is what I was trying to say before, that we're now in a position, a numerical position, right? To enter into a different narrative that will lead to different action. Black Lives Matter is a continuation of the civil rights movement. It's a continuation of other movements that came before it, right? Mm-hmm. So that this has been a continuum. And this is what I was saying. We look at recent history as if things started now. The civil rights movement, other movements before it for liberation have been continuous, Right. So what we're seeing now is the result of that consistency and that continuity. What I'm not seeing is that we continue framing the conversation based on what oppresses us. What oppresses us. I hear that. If we now accept the fact, right, because so many people from disenfranchised communities stood up, especially the African-American community with its consistency over time, providing the pathway and providing the structure, right, that Alexis was talking about, the infrastructure that we need to change situations, to enter into a dialogue of change, right? Then why are we always using the yardstick in terms of what oppresses us, right? This totally is a moment that we're saying that the numerical majority was us. Right. The numerical majority was us. It was the African-American community, the Latino community is the second group voting, the Asian community, the Native community came out in mass, right? Yeah. You can say it was for Biden, but basically was against Trump. It was against death. It was against death, so going to your point, right? Yeah. Because we know, and the people are comfortable saying that another 200,000 people are going to die. And everybody's taking it almost like a norm, right? That's our people. Where is our anger? Where is our building of institutions, of network, of lobbying groups that addresses this? And if we continue the conversation of why are we excluded from this, or why are people acting towards us, it's systemic racism, Our country was built on our backs.
But what are we gonna do about it? We're talking about systemic racism. Wait a minute. We're talking about systemic. What are we gonna do about it? How do we get the LGBT community, the African American community, the Caribbean community, the white progressive community, women? How do we organize them now, so that we can implement the changes we want with the Biden administration? Because we can't depend on him to do it. We've got to do that.
Exactly.
Well,
So you're an organizer, I'm an organizer, we're all organizers around the table. That's what we should be talking about, organizing, not how we're going to do it. We're organizers.
And to some extent, that's why we're having this conversation. So people find their way. But we have some questions from those who are listening to us, and we want to give an opportunity to some of the audience to ask some questions. Nyya, you have some of the questions, or Bridget?
Yeah, and I think Bishop Raymond Rivera had a quick comment, though. I think he was trying to speak.
Yes, if you allow me, I'm trying to see, to pick up on three words. Well, one of our women said space, and others have been using the term transcendence. And I'm trying to make some application of all of this to where I function, which is at a contextual level in the parish. And how does this all apply to everyday existential living? In other words, when one of the speakers talked about labor rights, well, how did that connect to the living wage struggle in New York City for the last 5 years that me and other clergy people led? How did it connect to the minimum wage struggle, which some of us were on the front lines of those struggles? In other words, how do these conversations at this level connect to the existential, contextual reality of our people? And let me just suggest two things. As far as space in our own ministry, the Latino Pastoral Action Center, like Malta's, is an indigenous organization, 25 years old. We own our own property. We have 5 charter schools that are community grown and community controlled. Now, some would automatically say, oh my God, a charter school, because they're captured by the fundamentalist left. And they see that as, so these conversations, I don't want to say they're simplistic, but they deny the creative tension and the existential reality at a base level that exists in all our communities. I've met with AOC several times.
Okay, Ray, could you get to the point you want to make?
Well,
I'm sorry, but the time is moving.
Right. So talking about AOC, I support AOC totally. I was her Martin Luther King speaker at her congressional rally on Martin Luther King Day, and we addressed the crowd together. And I think she is probably the best thing that has happened in the context of electoral politics. But now, contrary to what I've heard today, there are elements in the Democratic Party that say that she's the reason that they lost moderate districts, and they're trying to demonize her again. So I think we have to begin to articulate what has been said here on a larger element, that it was the progressive forces that gave Biden the election, but that's not the dominant argument now in the press. They're trying to blame AOC and that wing of the party for losing congressional seats. And I think that's the actual reality that's happening in the dominant discourse of politics.
It's not dominant. We need to change our language. It's not dominant. I just said we're the numerical majority, right? So how do we become the numerical majority, and how do we act like the numerical majority? How do we create the spaces to talk from power, not from deficit?
We have questions from the audience.
That all of our people are listening to Univision, and they're listening to all the dominant stations, and the narrative that they're internalizing is that AOC and the left wing of the party was responsible for weakness. So we have to join that dialogue We can believe that it doesn't exist, but it really doesn't.
I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I mean, I think that we have the numbers that we can go to Univision. We have the capacity of having Facebook conversations with her. We have creativity
But we
to
do it,
create
but we
spaces
did, but we
to
didn't
have that
do it.
discussion.
But we didn't do it with Goya. If there was a time for us to do it, we should have done it with Goya. So what we need to do is organize better.
There's still, Goya has had repercussions, economic repercussions.
It hasn't changed their politics.
Well,
that fool is still talking to Bush, whatever his name is, Trump.
We're not expecting to change it immediately, but let's move on for questions for the group. I want to just say quickly that, Raymond, you talked about doing the stuff on the streets, being there contextually. Everyone on this panel is contextual in their work. They're not just thinkers. Everyone here is, and without thinking, we wouldn't even know that people are being exploited, that there's a problem with labor. Somebody thought that up first, that's problematic, that somebody, so you can't divorce, you need praxis. You can't divorce action with the intellectual life. In fact, that might be a problem that we have in our community, that there's not enough discussion going on. But let's go on to the questions that some people posed.
Sure. So we have a question about how do we come together to understand intersectionality and be able to move forward in order to design, formulate change and formulate our narrative. And that comes from Julia on Facebook. So once again, how do we come together to understand intersectionality and be able to move forward in order to design / formulate change and formulate our narrative? And I do want to hold space for that. This uses the term intersectionality. So if you're familiar with that term, maybe you're able to speak to this question and give our audience.
I'm thinking of Edgar and Natasha, and if you want to respond.
I was going to suggest Davis.
Yeah, Davis. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Natasha, can you translate?
Yo creo lo primero que hay que entender que la interseccionalidad es un asunto político. Todo es político. Y la interseccionalidad tiene que pasar. Yo no tengo que conocerte a ti. Yo no tengo que entenderte a ti. Yo tengo que respetar. Yo soy un hombre gay, yo soy un hombre negro, yo soy un hombre caribeño, yo soy un hombre, o sea, en mí no hay una sola lucha, en mí hay muchas luchas. Entonces, yo creo que tenemos que empezar primero, por ejemplo, los LGBT negros, ¿no? Que sufrimos la discriminación por ser negros y por ser LGBT. En el sentido práctico, tenemos que involucrarnos en otros movimientos, crear alianzas estratégicas, alianzas políticas, alianzas que incluyan el discurso de uno en el otro. Eso es muy importante, sobre todo aquí en Nueva York, porque vivo en Nueva York, lo voy a decir ahora. Aquí en Nueva York hay unas barreras, comenzando por la barrera idiomática. Si yo voy a un lugar, en downtown, y ese lugar LGBT es un lugar LGBT para blancos. Y aunque yo quiera entrar, no puedo entrar porque la cultura del lugar no me deja entrar. Entonces, ¿dónde yo entro? En Harlem, porque yo soy un negro dominicano, y en Washington High Harlem yo puedo entrar. Pero ¿qué sucede? Que lo más importante es entender que yo tengo que, desde mi organización, y quiero reconocer lo que se dice aquí, nosotros tenemos una historia de resistencia, nosotros tenemos una historia, nosotros hemos construido nuestro camino sin el poder. Tenemos que lograr entender hoy en cuándo los LGBT vamos a romper el gueto LGBT para que otros temas entren en nosotros, pero eso lo tienen que hacer los líderes. Tiene que haber una estrategia coordinada de acrecentar aquí en Estados Unidos y también en el Caribe, acrecentar las coaliciones, y eso es muy importante, las alianzas estratégicas que vinculen diferentes temas. Tenemos que romper los guetos y eso se rompe con acciones políticas desde las organizaciones, Black, los movimientos, el movimiento de las madres tiene que plantar postura con lo que pasa con las mujeres negras trans en esta ciudad, en Nueva York. Los LGBT tenemos que plantar postura con lo que pasa con las personas negras que somos nosotros, afroamericanas y negras que somos nosotros. Y en español se puede decir negro.
Can we translate a little bit? Because
okay, yeah, oh, sí, recuerdo.
I want you to know this. I had him preach at my church and I lost like half the congregation. They never came. Natasha, could you?
I'll try to summarize because I mean, Delvis is powerful on his own. So he began by saying that the notion of intersectionality is inherently a political one, and we have to understand it from that perspective. And you know that he is a Black man, he's a gay man, he's a Caribbean man, and all of these identities live within him, and that he, as you know, has to occupy each one of those spaces. He doesn't have the option of opting out, and as a result, you know, the organizations that he's affiliated with, their struggles, their stories, and trajectories of struggle have also need to evolve to be able to also assume the same positions, to understand these struggles as inherently interconnected. And then that starts with the political leadership of each one of them. And so what does it mean for Black Lives Matter to assume a political position on Black trans women's lives? They do. Or for historically, they do, LGBT organizations and spaces to talk about the impact on Black LGBT queer folks. And you know, what he talked about his own experience, you know, in New York. What does it mean for him in New York to go to an LGBT space where it's going to be all white, and then there's no kind of conceptualization of what it means to have that space be receptive to Black gay and queer folks.
You know, pero que yo no entiendo porque los espacios en Harlem él los llama ghetto y después los espacios blancos no los llama ghetto.
No. Yo hablaba, porque también
esa fue la palabra que usaste, mi amor.
Sí, yo sé, pero decir que los espacios blancos también son ghettos, o sea, nosotros solemos.
Pero no lo llamaste ghetto. Llamaste Sterling Harlem ghetto.
Yeah, but Martha, what he meant was the silo system.
No dije por Harlem Ghetto, y pido disculpas si tú lo entendiste así. No tengo ese tipo de lenguaje ni siquiera, pero solemos hacer, en lo que dije fue que en Nueva York, ¿no? Aquí, pero también en mi país, solemos hacer muchos guetos. O sea, gueto es todos, o sea, todos nos metemos en nuestros rincones y que tenemos que, para poder ser fuertes, tenemos que romper eso.
Sí,
aquí hay ejemplos claros de eso, pero sí. No pasa, pero no lo dije para nosotros, porque sería discriminativo de mí. O sea, yo estoy muy orgulloso de mi lucha. Lo puse en el momento, así que te pido disculpas si lo entendiste por ahí, pero no es por ahí que va la cosa.
We have the power today.
Lo que quiero dejar claro es que si queremos lograr la interseccionalidad plena, tenemos que comenzar a actuar dentro de nosotros mismos, dentro de nuestros espacios políticamente, porque yo no tengo que entender completamente el movimiento feminista para unirme a las mujeres en la lucha. Yo tengo que asumir esa lucha porque el mismo derecho que yo tengo lo tienen ellas. Y eso es lo importante. No tenemos que comprender todo para entender que todo el mundo tiene derechos y que una lucha se vincula con otras luchas. Y que es una decisión política, de unirnos a la lucha. Y tú pusiste un ejemplo interesante, cómo el movimiento Black Lives Matter se vinculó con el movimiento trans, porque realmente
tomó una posición
the way we can organize, the way we can show our power is we have a mayoral election coming up. Who are we going to support? How are we going to support them? What kind of monies are we going to direct toward that candidate? And can we establish a candidate that we like now? That includes Natasha, Davies, Marta, Sammy, me, all of us. How do we show our power right now? We are 3/4 of the city, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and God knows who else. We can actually take this town. How do we do it? And I agree with Delvis 100%. It has nothing to do with intersectionality. When you start organizing these projects, as I have done many, many years, and you start knocking on those doors, you begin to identify with people when you see how they're living, when you see the pipes rotting, when you see rats, yes, in the projects, rats running through their apartments. Your compassion has to come out. If we want to start somewhere, there are 500,000 people in the projects, that can win in any election. We need to start somewhere. We need to organize, as Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael used to say, do not say anything until you're ready to organize and build a united front. That is what we need right now.
We have room for one more question from the audience, please.
Yes. So, and before I'm sorry, before my last question, I didn't introduce my co-host, Bridget Webster, who is a student here at Union and will present the last question of the night.
By the way, Union has the most amazing students of any school in the world. I'm not exaggerating. Look at Nyya and Bridget. They're amazing people. Go ahead. But Nyya, you had a question. Who has a question?
Bridget's going to pose the last question.
Okay. Yes. So our last question comes from Adrian Bickham on Facebook. And she says, please discuss the U.S. policy of the blockade of Cuba. The U.S. blockade of Cuba and the decolonization and the colonization of Guantanamo are continuous evidence of empire. There is very little, if any, global support of the U.S. policy, yet instead of following the Obama administration of trying to normalize relations, we are seeing a reversal under Trump.
The reason for a lot of that under Trump.
And also, since I'm in Cuba now, to talk about that. And, you know, I mean, I think it's really important that we talk about the blockade, which often gets lost and when we think of the Caribbean, ironically, and to understand the nuance of the blockade, which is often called like sanctions regimes, as more than just Cold War era policies right now. Cuba has lost, like, you know, the military interest that it originally held for the United States and wanting to control it. And right now, it's really, and the sanctions regimes that's been upped under Trump, I think has to do with two things. Centered around Miami, but not based on Cuban Americans, based on Venezuela. And that Cuba has become the proxy in many ways for trying to damage Venezuela and to get at the, you know, source of what historically has been economic might in the region there through Cuba. I don't think there's no real interest in having an ideological shift in Cuba. It's not a political project around socialism anymore. It's much more about trying to satisfy the Cuban American vote, which is why you saw the discourse of socialism and equating Biden with socialism only really be prevalent in South Florida. That was not the campaign discourse in New York or in, you know, Houston. It was directed at a particular audience. It wasn't just the Cuban Americans that know how to get out and vote. It was the Venezuelans who were there. And the fear of what they're, you know, what they think they're fleeing from, which I think is a much more interesting conversation for us to have as to where does that fear come? What is that the political elite fleeing to Miami is actually fleeing, and what is that about? But that, you know, what we also have to call attention to is that the embargo is illegal, all aspects of it. And we think of it as just sanctions, or we think of it as these laws and that operate within this legal framework that somehow sanitizes it in a way. And instead of understanding the direct impact that it has on millions of people's lives by design. I mean, the State Department said at the beginning of the embargo, you know, in 1961, that the purpose of the embargo is to provoke desperation, hunger, and despair in the Cuban people with the idea that they will then topple their own government. That will not happen, right? And I think under Biden, we can expect to see a move towards Obama era policies, hopefully a full embracing of them. But even that was so bare minimum. It was just diplomatic relations. It wasn't even the normalization. And we have to think about, like, what is that about? The same way that the chokehold on Cuba exists, despite having been rejected by 190, every single country in the world rejects it every year in the United Nations vote, except for the United States and Israel. And last year, Brazil joined them because Bolsonaro. But we have to think about, what is it that Cuba represents as a threat? It's not a military threat. Right? It's not a real kind of like political threat in that way. It was a threat originally for Puerto Rico to look at as a model of what liberation looks like, particularly because of the joint historical and cultural struggles there, but also what it represents kind of regionally. Why does this chokehold exist? And while originally it was ideological, now it's heavily economic as it's tied to the region, and to understand it like that, and to really think about what I think Cuba has allowed in many US spaces is to disrupt that US exceptionalism, to understand to inspire actual solidarity movements and struggles in a way that we don't see prevalent throughout much of US activist spaces, and that has infused and informed our own analysis beyond just class struggle. That has been, to me, like one of the most significant contributions of the Cuban Revolution in many ways to activist spaces. But I appreciate the question because I think it often gets glossed over as something that we don't have to devote political capital to, as either beyond us or, where we continue to be nurtured by what Cuba continues to do to sustain its revolution, especially in COVID times. I can tell you, to live, in a country that is under a blockade, increased sanctions regimes in the middle of a pandemic and a global economic crisis and in hurricane season is not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. And so we, I think, have to make room in our spaces, not to just draw inspiration from Cuba, but to really be willing to put kind of our own social and political capital behind toppling all sanctions regimes. The embargo was just the most accelerated version of that.
Well said. Well said.
We've come to, our time has ended. I want to thank Union Theological Seminary for supporting its faculty, myself in this case, in doing this type of work. I want to thank Ian Rees from the communications department that has been so supportive. Bridget, for your help with us tonight, and Nyya, who I've called 86 times today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samuel.
I'm not saying this in a condescending, patronizing way at all. I mean it sincerely. It is a pleasure and a blessing to me to know all of you. Some I speak to more often than not, but my life is rich just because my drives from Brooklyn to New Jersey are always filled with conversations, either with Malta or Dr. Bishop Rivera, Felipe Luciano, Edgar, although he moved to California, I'm going to keep him as a friend, Alexa Davies, who's a member of my congregation. He gives me trouble, but what can I do? But thank you so much, and thank you to all the audience. Take care. Really appreciate you being with us tonight.
God bless you.
Thank you.
God bless you. God bless you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.